with everything. We're going to be talking about Stargates, pyramids, and portals, and Atlantis. Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Doug, and it'll be a delight tonight to be on with Tim Alberino and you and Joe and share some of the most amazing revelations I think that God has preserved for this time. When you wrote the introduction you wrote to tonight's show on, your website, Hagman and Hagman.com, I was blown away because I think it's important, and I know it's important, that there are specific things that God reserves for specific times to reveal. And as we go to the radio tonight, and for the record, it's February 18th, 2015, the slaughter of our brethren worldwide is absolutely a rehash of what the devil has always sought to do, wipe the very image and creation of the living God off the world stage. So when you hear of what's going on to the brethren across the world and 21 Christians being beheaded and a sea of blood, these are all biblical not only references but images coming to mind. So, you quoted today, George Orwell said it best, he who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. And what Tim Alberino and I are going to be talking about tonight is to put things into perspective. Unless you understand the book of Genesis, and there are a lot of people who say, I don't want to even bother myself with it, you cannot understand the basis of the war that's raging in the heavens, that's soon to be manifest in every one of your lives, my life, our lives, my children's lives, and my grandkids' lives. So tonight we're going to talk about just the battle that is on and why Stargates, pyramids, giants, and Atlantis, and the suppression of history is so important. Now, Tim will get in the later part of the show, and I'm going to take about 5 minutes and read something, and I'm going to turn it directly over to Tim. Most people don't get the significance of giants. Most people don't understand that there's a very group of insidious Luciferian and fallen angels trying to control the history of the past so that they can insert at the time and place of their choosing a whole, if you will, artificial or synthetic paradigm into the battle between good and evil. There's a mouthful. Now, I'm reading from Phineas T. Dakes. It's on my website, stevequayle.com. I'm sorry, it's on Genesis6Giants.com, Genesis6Giants.com. And the question is, why giants? You get emails like that. I know Tim's gotten them. I get them all the time. So why is this so important? Well, it's really important, and I'm going to read this in quote. This is Phineas Dake. By the grace of God, I will always give attribution when I know it because, again, the Scripture is very clear on people who steal each man's words from another. If God isn't powerful enough to give preachers original text, then the preacher, I would say, doesn't understand his calling. They can argue with me, they can do whatever they want, but the bottom line is, as I've quoted Campbell McAlpine before, he said, if it doesn't burn in your heart, don't preach it. And if it doesn't burn in your heart, you better check out your heart. Why Giants by Phineas Dakes. And we give it over to Tim. We'll talk about his amazing accelerated expedition to Sardinia and why it's critical and how getting ready for South America and the expedition that's going to take place there in the coming weeks, how this all ties together. And again, this couldn't, Doug, Joe, and Tim, have happened 5 years ago. It couldn't have happened 10 years ago because, quite candidly, it wasn't time. But the time of the revealing is upon us. It was the purpose of Satan and his fallen angels to corrupt the human race and thereby do away with pure Adamic stock, through whom the seed of the woman should come. This would avert their own doom and make it possible for Satan and his kingdom to keep control of the planet Earth indefinitely. It was said to Adam and Eve that the seed of the woman should defeat Satan and restore man's dominion. Genesis 3:15, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. The only way then for Satan to avoid this predicted defeat was to corrupt the pure Adamite or Adamic line, so that the coming of the seed of woman into the world would be made impossible. This he tried to accomplish by sending some of his fallen angels to marry the daughters of men, as in Genesis 6:1-4. I call Genesis 6, for the record, the absolute Rosetta Stone to understanding all of history, and to understanding all conspiracies and to understanding all spiritual warfare. Back to what Phineas Dykes wrote. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives, all of which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became the mighty men which are of old, men of renown, and producing the giant nations through them. Now this is critical because some people want to argue that this is a Sethite versus a Canaanite. Wrong. There were giants in those days before the flood and after the flood. Interestingly enough, Doug, and we talked about this once, but it came as a revelation to me instantly about, maybe 3 months ago, that, and I've never thought this before, being a researcher, written up, literally years and years of study, but the only two places the word Nephilim is used is in Genesis 6 and Numbers 13:33. After that, the word Rephaim, or the giants, are used exclusively. There are two such eruptions of fallen angels taught in Genesis 6:4. There were giants in the earth in those days before the flood, and also after that, after the flood, when the sons of God, the fallen angels, came into the daughters of men, and any daughters of men, whether they were Cain's daughters, Seth, and others, and they bare children to them, and which is meaning the angels. Satan almost succeeded in his plan during the first eruption, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth, and all the multitude, and Noah and his sons were the only pure Adamic stock left to be preserved by the ark. Now, they weren't morally perfect, obviously, but they certainly were genetically perfect. And that should astound people. If they go back and look at the populations projected in those days, 8 out of, if it was 10 million, 15 million, 100 million, whatever it was, that's very few. And it leads to the immediate statement that the remnant is very, very small. 1 Peter 3:19-20, by which also he went, Jesus, preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when the once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being built or being prepared, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water. The main objective of the flood was to do away with all satanic corruption, destroy the giants, and preserve the pure Adamic stock, so as to make good the guarantee of the coming of the seed of woman, as in the plan of God. Now, everyone, how do I say this, fast forward into the times that we're talking about. And we're talking about the end of humanity as God created us through artificial intelligence, through cyborgs, through transhumanism, through singularity. All those things I've written about extensively in Xenogenesis. Tom Horn and I have done hours on Hagman and Hagman trying to address these issues. Even Elon Musk is worried about the, if you will, the termination machines that are already in place. So behind all this, ladies and gentlemen, is a very real devil, very real fallen angels. And so when we get right now to Tim's expedition and how this came about in such an accelerated way, because we weren't planning to go, and I did not go. Tim, another brother, and we won't give out their names, but 2 other people accompanied Tim to Sardinia, where Tim basically interviewed some of the oldest, well-informed people, and it's going to be amazing to hear the story. So, Tim, I want you to share now, if you would. We're talking about giants. We're talking about the universal presence of giants. We're talking about the universal, if you will, presentation of pyramids all over the world, yet the great cover-up continues until that time that the evil and the evil ones and all their minions and all their controllers decide to spin it for their benefit. And we get into maybe an hour or so away, we'll be talking about the 10 kings that no one wants to deal with in the book of Revelation. And I think you'll be pretty astounded, Doug, Joe, and everyone listening, that there are other alternatives for just the standard dispensationalism, which, for the record, I have rejected for 20-some years. But the point is that, Tim, share about the fascinating undertaking, how it came to, take place in Sardinia, and what basically the amazing doors and testimonies that were opened up to you and the team.
Okay. a week ago today, actually, I just got back from Sardinia, got back on the 11th. And about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, somewhere in that area, I received a phone call from an individual who told me about a certain situation in Sardinia, Italy, concerning evidence of giants, and specifically concerning possible fragments, bones, and implements that belong to a race of giants. So obviously, Steve and I were very interested in this, and we decided that this is something we need to go and take a look at right away, because we were also told that the government was, that it was a very oppressive situation over in Sardinia, something that many people don't know about, that the government of Sardinia, specifically the archaeological institutions in Sardinia, are oppressing certain individuals who I won't name on this broadcast, are oppressing certain individuals in Sardinia because they have been investigating and turning up evidence of giants on the island. Now, before I begin to talk about this, for those who don't know where Sardinia is located, Sardinia is a large island off the western coast of Rome. It's kind of above Sicily. It's off the western coast of Rome. There's the little island of Corsica above Sardinia. Corsica belongs to the French. Sardinia belongs to Italy. So Sardinia is Italy. It's a part of Italy. but like Sicily, it kind of has its own cultural background, but it is part of Italy. So anyway, Steve and I thought, after looking at what we were told and after doing a little bit of research on Sardinia ourselves, we decided this is something that we need to do immediately while there's still something to be seen, before all of the evidence completely disappears, or before the oppression gets so bad that people won't be willing to talk anymore. So within 2 weeks of getting this phone call, I was on an airplane with two other individuals heading for Sardinia, basically heading for Rome, and then from Rome to Sardinia. And I didn't know what to expect, except that we were looking for evidence of giants, something to do with artifacts concerning giants. And once we went into the interior of Sardinia and met the contact who we were going to talk to, and who was going to be taking us around Sardinia, showing us certain archaeological sites, I quickly became convinced that this was something monumental in terms of discoveries relating to giants. We interviewed this gentleman in Sardinia, and he told us some astounding stories, which, quite frankly, some of them were so astounding that it was hard for us to believe. We were quite skeptical to begin with. The first day of our time with this individual was spent just interviewing him, and after we interviewed him and also interviewed a few other individuals, and I'll get into some of the things that they said in a minute. Again, we were pretty skeptical, but after the interviews, the next day we went and began to see for ourselves the evidence that is still standing in Sardinia. And this individual grew up in Sardinia. He grew up in the same village all of his life, and he's very familiar with all of Sardinia, especially the immediate area around the village in which he lives. Again, I'm not going to name this individual yet, because we have an ongoing investigation, and there's some other things that we're doing. So we're going to have to be vague tonight, but we have a film coming out that's going to show all the details and lots of footage of the interviews and everything. But tonight we're going to be a little bit vague. But this individual, where he lived and grew up, where he was born in Sardinia, happens to be an area that is literally just absolutely ensconced in megalithic ruins. And what was more impressive to me, and what I immediately was able to recognize, were mounds. And when I say mounds, I'm talking about mounds like unto the mounds that were discovered in the United States 100 years ago, a couple hundred years ago, when the whole of this country was at one time dotted with these mounds, artificial mounds that were constructed by a race of giants. And for anybody who's familiar with the history of the Smithsonian and has read Steve's books, will be familiar with the Smithsonian cover-up of the red-haired race of giants, not just red-haired, but prominently red-haired race of giants that once existed in the United States, that once lived in the United States. And so immediately, by the way, most of those mounds have been taken apart, and obviously whatever remains of giant skeletons were to be found inside of them, because basically they were tombs, have since been removed by the Smithsonian. And, of course, nobody really knows where they've gone. They've taken the bones and either destroyed them, or they're in some dusty room in the back of the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., or wherever. But Sardinia, particularly around the village of this individual who we were interviewing, is absolutely dotted with these mounds. They're everywhere. And we're talking about the artificial mounds. And it's hard for me to describe the mounds over the radio, but we have plenty of footage of these mounds that we're going to be putting in our documentary film. And it is very apparent that these are, in fact, artificial mounds. And on top of many of these mounds, in fact, on top of all of them, there are ruins, megalithic ruins, the remains of megalithic ruins. So that's the first thing that we noticed right off the bat. And obviously we had an interpreter with us, and so this individual didn't speak English, so everything was through an Italian interpreter. And we began to see that we are dealing with a situation that is reminiscent of the America in the mid and late 19th century, when all of these giant bones were being dug up. Except the difference in Sardinia is that they're still there for the most part. The giant bones are still there, and the mounds are still there, and the ruins are still there, and the stories are still there. So basically, again, we realized really quickly, hey, we're kind of like in the United States in the late 19th century or the mid-19th century, when all this stuff was starting to literally pop out, was being dug up from these burial sites. And so we started to get really excited because, again, the first day we had heard a lot of testimony. We were kind of skeptical because a lot of it was really sensational. But now we're starting to actually get out and start to see stuff out there. And, the excitement is beginning to grow because, hey, we've got mounds. And we started to go up and visit some of these sites and go up on top of some of these mounds. And without a doubt, we were dealing with megalithic structures that are very similar to the different megalithic sites around the world, the different ancient megalithic sites around the world. But paradoxically, I had never heard of all of these megalithic ruins existing in Sardinia. I've done a lot of research, and I never came across the fact that Sardinia was still full of these artificial mounds and megalithic ruins. So something that we noticed immediately was that every site that had megalithic ruins also had trees planted in rows in front of it. And we were told quite matter-of-factly that the municipalities were ordered to plant the trees in front of these sites in order to conceal the fact that they existed, that they were there. And so that's one of the first things that we noticed was we'd look down over the ridge and we'd look down the hill and there was a town, and from the town you could see the megalithic sites. And so from that view, from that perspective, trees were carefully planted in rows to cover up what was on top of the mound, what was on top of the particular site that we were on. And so it became apparent very quickly that we were dealing with a cover-up, and not a very good one, because in a nutshell, what's happening in Sardinia and what's happened in Sardinia, both according to the testimony that we were able to get on camera and also according to our own eyewitness account, we went and we saw that this is in fact the case, is that for years now there's been an effort to get rid of anything that doesn't fit into the archaeological norms of the historical orthodoxy. So In other words, in Sardinia, the historians, I should say the archaeologists, are willing and eager to show everybody ruins that belong to the Romans or the Carthaginians, or the culture that they call the Nuraghi culture, but they absolutely deny the existence, pretend that the ruins that belong to a more ancient culture with more sophisticated technology, they pretend that they're not even there. They literally pretend that there's nothing to see there. And again, in fact, trees are planted in front of all of these sites. And on any kind of site that you see in Sardinia that looks like a pyramid, which we'll get to in a minute, any site that looks like geometric symmetry, anything that looks like it might have been a building of some kind that is not identified in the archaeological orthodoxy as a touristic site is covered with trees, so that it obscures its shape and blocks some of the megalithic ruins that are still there. They've removed, and when I say they, I'm talking about two organizations, one specifically, which is at the heart of everything, which is the Vatican, and then the municipalities of Sardinia that are basically taking orders from the Vatican to remove everything, especially anything that has to do with the bones of giants. And I've never been, in my entire life, I've never been in a place, and for the listeners, I lived in Peru for 10 years, and Peru still has a lot of crazy archaeological stuff, but I've never been in a place where I felt like I was literally standing on top of giant bones. That's what I felt like everywhere I went in Sardinia. It felt like if we were to dig down into this mound, we would discover giant bones. And now, right off the bat, let me tell everybody why we didn't dig anywhere in Sardinia. The reason why we didn't dig anywhere in Sardinia is because it is explicitly banned to look for giant bones. And I asked this is coming from one of our contacts there, and I asked him, so there's a specific law against actually looking for giant bones, giant artifacts? He said, absolutely. In other words, you can't go digging down into mounds looking for anything, because they know you're going to probably discover, in certain areas, you're certainly going to discover giant bones, remains of gigantic humanoid entities. We were standing actually in one particular on the first place that we went to, the first place that we visited, not far from our contact's home. You can see his village down the hill. We were shown the area where our contact first discovered a giant skeleton when he was a child. And his story goes that when he was a child, he used to play in this area that used to have a lot of megalithic ruins still standing. In other words, standing structures were there. And he describes all these structures to detail, and we got it all on camera, and it's going to be in the film. That when he was a child, he used to play. When he was, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, he used to play up there with his friends. And, the village was only a mile away, so they used to run up there and play around the ruins, the megalithic ruins. And they used to play inside of the different caves and the different tombs and the different structures that were still open at that time, which would have been some 50 odd years ago. And he described for us with great detail the first time he came upon a giant skeleton as we stood over the grave of that giant. And the grave was a very large grave. And again, we have it on film. Very large grave. And you could obviously see that there was some sort of a structure, some sort of a megalithic ceiling, and that the grave was definitely constructed, or at least